In Search of the Overself by Antti Savanainen. Raphael Hurst was born in London in 1898 and died in Geneva in 1981. Paul Brunton was his pen name, and he is chiefly remembered as a transmitter of Eastern spiritual teachings, especially yoga and meditation, to Western seekers. His book, The Wisdom of the Overself, is well established as his magnum opus. I will examine Brunton's relationship with Theosophy and his most important spiritual teacher, Ramana Maharshi, using Annie Fung's dissertation on the science of religion as the main source. I will also evaluate some of Brunton's teachings from the perspective of Theosophy. Paul Brunton's relationship with Theosophy. Brunton's first spiritual experiences, in his own words, a series of mystical ecstasies, occurred at the age of 16. They were preceded by the practice of meditation and a burning desire to reach the spiritual self. These experiences sensitized his mind, and Brunton experienced such a strong separation between himself and everyday life that he had the idea of ending his days. But intensive reading of spiritual teachings dissuaded him from suicide. He became very interested in death and decided to explore the subject further through literature. Through his readings, Brunton became acquainted with theosophical literature and joined the Theosophical Society. Brunton gave Theosophy credit for giving him his first introduction to Eastern thought. According to him, Theosophy gave the world valuable spiritual teachings in the 19th century. It weakened the influence of scientific materialism and promoted respect between religions. However, Brunton felt that by the 20th century, the society had lost its spiritual vitality and that the adepts behind it had withdrawn, leaving it to its own devices. He felt he had learned a lot from studying Theosophy, but after 2 years he resigned from the society. Brunton considered the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, H.P. Blavatsky, a genius who had not received the respect she deserved in the eyes of the world. To his son Kenneth Hurst, Brunton recommended Blavatsky's Key to Theosophy as an easy, helpful, and interesting introduction. Brunton's appreciation did not prevent him from seeing weaknesses in Blavatsky's character. Although he did not exclude the possibility that she had received instruction from unknown masters, he doubted Blavatsky's conception of the masters of the Great White Brotherhood living in Tibet. In any case, he thought he was continuing the work started by Blavatsky in his own way. One can agree with this to some extent, because both brought Eastern esotericism to the West. Ramana Maharshi. Maharshi as Paul Brunton's teacher. Brunton accidentally met a student of Ramana Maharshi on the street of Madras, now Chennai, India, who insisted that he meet Maharshi. Brunton refused, as it did not fit in with his travel plans, but he changed his mind after meeting another Indian teacher who insisted even more strongly that he should meet Maharshi. Brunton asked around Madras about him, but no one knew anything about him. Maharshi represented the Hindu school of Advaita Vedanta, which emphasizes monism. Maharshi gave little oral instruction to Brunton, and his influence was mainly of another kind. Brunton describes how he experienced an indescribable peace just by sitting near Maharshi. Brunton became aware of Maharshi's atmosphere and how it affected his being. It seems that Brunton had a profound experience of his overself under Maharshi's presence. Later on, Brunton made Maharshi famous in India and the rest of the world. Here are some excerpts from Maharshi's teachings from Brunton's book, A Search in Secret India. To the one who has realized the true self, there is neither master nor disciple. Such a one regards all people with equal eye. You must find the master within you, within your own spiritual self. Every man is divine and strong in his real nature. What are weak and evil are his habits, his desires and thoughts, but not himself. Pursue the inquiry, who am I, relentlessly. Analyze your entire personality. Try to find out where the I thought begins. Physical contact with Maharshi was broken in 1939 as a result of an incident between Brunton and Maharshi's followers. But the spiritual link was not broken, and Brunton said he was in telepathic contact with Maharshi until his death in 1950 and even afterward. Maharshi and the ideal of the sage. Brunton had two other teachers besides Maharshi. One was the Advaita Vedanta expert and theosophist Subramania Iyer, who drew a clear distinction between a yogi and a sage. The yogi knows his inner self and is content in his silence, living without a care for the world. The sage also gains knowledge of the universal self, but does not withdraw from the world, instead working constantly for the benefit of others. Meyer taught Brunton that there is no personal salvation. That is the worst kind of selfishness. Iyer's teaching is in this respect similar to those of Mahayana Buddhism and Theosophy. Brunton ended up considering Maharshi as a perfect yogi, but not yet a sage. For the sage, the suffering of others is his. For the yogi, it is not. The Maharshi was an adept in mysticism, that is, yoga, but his idea of truth needs to be disputed. He says that the sage can watch with indifference the slaughter of millions of people in battle. That is quite true of the yogi, but it will never be true of those who have sacrificed every future nirvanic beatitude to return to earth until all are saved. They alone are entitled to the term sage, nor can they do otherwise, for they have found the unity of all human beings. They would never have returned if they did not feel for others. Despite this criticism, Brunton considered Maharshi to be of great and unshakable importance to him, even if he did not agree with all of Maharshi's ideas. On the other hand, one can understand Maharshi's position to some extent. Perhaps it is the case that in the consciousness of the higher self, individuality experiences the great life and its perfection despite all the suffering and evil in the world. Also, from a more profound point of view, everything is indeed in order. But this does not and must not lead to indifference to human suffering. On the contrary, experience of the great life can encourage the seeker of truth to realize the sublime ideal of service. The Overself. Brunton arrived at the concept of the Overself, which he used to describe the higher aspect of the human entity. Brunton got this idea from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay The Oversoul. In Indian thought, the equivalent concept is Atman, translated into English as self. Brunton considered this translation inadequate. With his term Overself, he wanted to clearly distinguish between the empirical self, the ego, and the divine self. Brunton's concept of the Overself first appears in his book In Search of Secret India, which represents the mystical phase of his work. By this time, he had already met Maharshi. According to Fung, this book shows the influence of Theosophy, which diminished in Brunton's later philosophical phase, which, according to Fung, began in 1937, after Brunton met Iyer. Brunton's characterization of the Overself evolved from his concept of esoteric development. In his mystical phase, the Overself referred to the human being's higher individuality. Brunton described the Overself's influence as an intimate presence, a warm and soothing influence experienced in deep meditation. In theosophical teachings, the corresponding aspect of the Overself, the higher self, affects the empirical self-personality in three ways: as a voice of conscience, as an urge to search for truth, and as pure, selfless love. In his philosophical phase, Brunton emphasized the connection of the Overself with the world mind. In Theosophy, this is represented by the divine self, with which the higher self comes into contact through the process of initiation. Brunton does not speak of initiations in the theosophical way, but he describes similar achievements for the Overself. According to Brunton, the highest aim is a permanent connection with the Overself. Along the way, the seeker experiences contact with the Overself in rare, fleeting moments. Paul Brunton as a spiritual teacher. Brunton was a spiritual teacher because he gave specific advice on meditation and spiritual striving in his books. He also had students from all over the world. He did not give lectures, but he received people and maintained an extensive correspondence. Although he gave spiritual teachings, he had reservations about organized spiritual groups and was quite critical of the traditional guru-disciple relationship. According to Brunton, the Overself was the teacher to be sought before all others. The practical side of Brunton's teachings focused on exploring meditation, but he also highlighted the ethical requirements for the seeker. He stressed the importance of moral aspiration, emotional purification, and self-education as part of the spiritual path. Brunton called for the practice of meditation and, simultaneously, the purification and refinement of character. He stated that the selfish ego is an obstacle to union with the Overself, and mere meditation does not remove it. From the theosophical point of view, this teaching is both familiar and worthwhile. For instance, Pekka Ervast emphasized that without ethical aspiration accompanied by meditation, it is impossible to progress on the path of purification. Some critical views. Not surprisingly, Brunton was also criticized. Perhaps the most severe criticism of him came from Geoffrey Masson, whose parents were Brunton's avid students. I will discuss some of the accusations, which have sometimes cast Brunton in a questionable light. In 1942, Brunton predicted that World War III would break out 20 years later, in 1962. As a result, some of his students, including the Massons, moved to South America because Brunton believed it was the only safe continent. In 1961, Brunton withdrew his prediction by sending a letter to his students saying it was impossible to predict the future under the prevailing conditions, even though he still regarded 1962 as a critical year for world peace. This prediction can be considered correct. Humanity was closer to nuclear war than ever before during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Geoffrey Masson, who studied Sanskrit at Harvard, discovered that Brunton knew only a few words of the language. It also turned out that Brunton had not earned his doctorate on academic merit. Can we conclude that Brunton was an impostor because he could not read Vedanta texts in the original language? Of course not. Brunton's teacher Yair was particularly familiar with Indian texts in the original. From him, Brunton learned a lot about the content and spiritual interpretation of the Advaita Vedanta. Perhaps Brunton gave his followers the impression, as Masson seems to think, that he knew Sanskrit better than he did. But the value of his teachings does not depend on such expertise. Spiritual knowledge does not require academic credentials or technical knowledge of Sanskrit. Furthermore, Brunton had given Masson's father investment advice, which was unsound. Brunton admitted that he had made mistakes and was upset about it. He hoped that Masson's father would have received at least some emotional help from him over the decades to compensate for the financial losses. He promised to try to make up for the trouble he had caused by promising to remember Mason's father in his daily meditations, even though it might not be of any use to him in this incarnation. The Illumination of Paul Brunton. I will conclude with extracts from Brunton's experience of illumination. My final illumination happened in 1963. There was this bomb-like explosion of consciousness, as if my head had split open. It happened during the night in a state between sleeping and waking, and led to a deepening of the stillness. There was no need to meditate. The verse in the Bhagavad Gita which mentions that to the knower the day is as night, and the night is as day became literally true, and remains so. It came of itself, and I realized that the divine had always been with me and in me. I felt that my love for them people did not diminish, but on the contrary it greatly increased. There seems to be fear in some people that they will have to give up their personal affections if they take to the spiritual path. The truth is that they will give out more real love if it comes thought their higher self than if they do not. I was love. There was no need to go out of my way to love anyone.